Wizards and Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire are a casting class that has a wide variety of spells. Many of these spells can be cast rather quickly, making them viable in melee range, which makes the wizard good at multiclassing. The whole class revolves around the use of magic, and there are 5 schools of spell types: Illusions, Evocation, Transmutation, Conjuration, and Enchanting. Illusion spells generally debuff enemies or increase deflection on the caster. Evocation spells usually deal elemental damage to enemies. Transmutation spells debuff enemies and deal damage. Conjuration spells typically summon something that deals damage to foes, and enchanting spells usually buff the caster. Each has its own theme, and each can be specialized in by picking one of the 5 subclasses. Be wary though, wizards have some of the harshest penalties in the game for choosing one, and it is not advised unless you are extremely familiar with the class. Wizards use Arcane as their resource, and they use it to cast spells. Arcane works a bit differently than most other classes, and instead of just being able to spend it on abilities, they can only cast a certain number of spells from each power level. The amount they can cast from each increases as they level up, however. This means they don't have quite the flexibility that some classes do with their resource. Wizards can use items called grimoires that are not books that you learn spells from like the first game, but equipable items that you use to extend your casting repertoire. Grimoires always contain a maximum of 2 spells per level, and the spells in a given grimoire are immutable. This means that each grimoire is unique, so be on the lookout for them. Also, just a note here that if a grimoire contains a spell of a school you cannot use because of a subclass, then you will not be able to cast them from the grimoire. In this section, we're going to take a look at the subclasses of the wizard and see why you might choose one of them or not. Wizard subclasses are more about what you lose than what you gain. In order to select a subclass, you will lose access to 2 schools of magic in order to gain increased power level and reduced recovery time with one particular school. This means you must be familiar with which spells belong to which schools, or risk making a decision you'll regret. Let's take a look at what the wizard subclasses are and talk a bit about what builds you can make with them. Conjurer. Conjurers specialize in summoning all manner of weapons, armor, creatures, and effects to harass and damage their enemies. Conjurers make excellent single-class casters or pure caster multi-class characters. Conjurers can summon a familiar that buffs their deflection, constitution, and power level. Conjuration spells focus primarily on calling effects that buff you or hinder or damage enemies, and they have some of the longest cast times in the game, so conjurers will have a larger focus on action speed than most casters. Dexterity can help with this tremendously, as can the rapid casting passive. Be sure to pick up Necrotic Lance as it hits extremely hard. When multiclassing, select Druid, Priest, or Enchanter if you would like some more spells. The only thing that other classes can really provide are passives that increase damage, crit damage, increased action speed, or reduced recovery time. Barbarians have Frenzy, which increases both their action speed, might, and constitution, which works well. Monks have Lightning Strikes, which increases their action speed and dexterity while also providing additional damage with weapons. And Paladins can increase the total damage to their target with Sworn Enemy. Enchanter. Enchanter wizards favor buffing themselves to the highest imaginable heights to the detriment of all other magic types. They are excellent at multiclassing, particularly for those wishing to be tanks. Enchanters gain immunity from the first dexterity affliction they suffer in combat and all others for a short period afterward. Nearly all Enchanter spells target the caster and have extremely short cast times, meaning they spend very little time casting. This gives them the opportunity to spend more time than most wizards attacking with weapons, and allows them to multiclass with martial classes more effectively. And since a good number of the spells are defensive, Enchanters make excellent candidates for the tank role. Pump Intellect to increase the long duration of these buffs. Enchanters can multiclass effectively with any class, however most of their buffs are meant for combat, so martial classes are a natural choice here. I suggest either Fighter, Paladin, Monk, or Druid. Unbroken are the most suited fighters to tanking because they can not only engage more enemies, but deal incredible damage to those that disengage from them, and so are the natural choice here. Just remember that Eldritch Aim and Discipline Barrage don't stack, so don't take both of these abilities. Paladins tank very well because of their high defensive capabilities, and their auras will gain a larger radius due to the high intellect that Enchanters have. Choose the Shield Bearers of St. Elka for the extra enemy engaged, as well as their ability to prevent someone from dying with Lay on Hands. Monks gain wounds when struck, allowing them to have a secondary resource pool. They work very well here because they typically wear no or light armor, and the defensive buffs from enchanting could offset this somewhat. Eldritch Aim also increases their hit chance, much like a fighter would. Druids work exceptionally well here because the short casting time of enchanting spells means they can spend time casting druid spells. Enchanting buffs also apply while shifted, so they can reach very high armor values while doing so and become extremely tanky. It's just win-win. Evoker. Evoker wizards are some of the most reliable damage dealers of the class and focus primarily on killing enemies. Select this subclass if you want stronger Evoker spells with a slight chance to double cast them. Evokers focus on dealing high damage to enemies, and their spells have shorter cast times than Conjurers. Since they have a chance to recast evocation spells instantly for free, they can generally outperform other schools in terms of raw damage. Evokers maintain access to enchanting spells, allowing them to buff in between casts. Many early Evoker spells have almost zero cast time and cannot miss. For this reason, and the fact they can still use enchanting spells, they can multiclass effectively with just about any class. I would suggest either Druid, Paladin, or Priest. Illusionist. Illusionists excel at crowd controlling enemies and debuffing them over all other wizards. The combination of these with spells that buff their deflection and defenses make them incredibly hard to kill. Illusionists not only blind and debuff enemies, they also increase their own deflection to extraordinary heights. First, they gain Reflexive Mirror, which gives them a huge boost to deflection if they are struck in combat, and it has an extremely long duration. And second, Lengrath's Displaced Image is one of the best early game tanking abilities there is, reducing many hits to grazes, also for a very long duration. Because of the long durations of many of their buffs, Intellect is much more important to the Illusionist than most other wizards. Illusionists multiclass very well with the same classes listed in the Enchanter section, but also Rogues. Rogues have a passive called Riposte that allows them to do full attacks against enemies that miss them with melee weapons that target deflection. This synergizes nicely because Illusionists specialize in deflection. Tricksters automatically gain some of these spells, so this could free up your ability points for rogue passives or other spells. Transmuter. Transmuters specialize in the art of debuffing many foes at once, protecting their group with lots of crowd control abilities. And because they still have access to conjuration spells, they still have moderate damage. Transmuters are great at rendering enemies ineffective and will spend a good amount of their time debuffing and CCing enemies. They can also change into a giant ogre, which works somewhat like the Druid Spirit Shift, and they cannot cast spells, just like the Shifter, while transformed. Because they want their targets to be CC'd for as long as possible, Transmuters will need to focus heavily on Intellect for best results. Transmuters will most likely multiclass with other casting classes or stay as a single class. However, Rogue works here because they deal increased damage with weapons against afflicted targets, and they have a passive Death Blows that increases the damage further if they have 2 or more afflictions at once. In addition, Transmuters can also paralyze targets, increasing the chance they will take crit damage substantially, and Assassins gain bonus to crit damage. No subclass. No subclass wizards have all spells available to them, which no subclass does. This is their biggest strength. Select this if you are a new wizard player or unsure just which spells you want to use, or just don't want to be locked out of 2 schools. No subclass wizards aren't locked out of any schools and so have access to all spells the wizard class possesses. This is a great reason to choose this, as some of the other bonuses are probably not strong enough to justify losing 2 schools. Unless you know just exactly which spells you want or are familiar with the full gamut of wizard spells, this is probably the best choice for you. No subclass wizards can multiclass in any manner they see fit, and any of the recommendations above will work for them. There are so many options it would be impossible to list them all here. The last thing we're going to cover here is attributes and races and how they affect the wizard. The game recommends Dexterity and Perception, and highly recommends Might and Intellect. Dexterity helps with action speed, making spells cast faster and their recovery time shorter. Perception helps with accuracy, which is very important to casters because they don't get bonuses to their spells from weapons or weapon abilities. Might helps with raw damage, and Intellect helps with AoE radius and duration. Just exactly how much of these you should have depends on the subclass you selected, and I will make my recommendations along with race here. Conjurer. Prioritize Dexterity, Intellect, and Might. Conjuration spells have some of the longest cast times in the game, so Dexterity goes a long way to making this faster. Intellect helps with some of the longer durations of the summons, and Might helps with damage. Perception isn't as important to a Conjurer because many of their spells target the ground or themselves, so accuracy isn't a priority. Godlike is a great choice here. Enchanter. Prioritize Intellect. Intellect helps with the duration of the buffs you apply to yourself or debuffs to enemies. What other attributes you will choose will depend on what you are doing when you aren't casting enchanting spells. Race varies. Evoker. Prioritize Might and Perception. Might for pure damage and Perception to make sure you connect. Note that many early level evocation spells cannot miss, but you will want this for the later ones. Mawa or Elf both work here. Illusionist. Prioritize Intellect and Perception. Illusion spells almost never deal damage, so you'll want to focus on duration of these spells via Intellect, as well as their accuracy via Perception. Elf and Godlike both make great choices. Transmuter. Prioritize Intellect, Dexterity, and Perception. Transmuters focus mainly on AoE debuffs and a bit of damage. Take Intellect to increase the AoE size of these spells as well as increase their duration. Dexterity helps with the longer cast times, and Perception ensures you will connect. Godlike for the win. No subclass. Prioritize Might, Intellect, Perception, and Dexterity. No subclass wizards will most likely use a wide variety of spells, so they will need a bit of everything. Any of the races listed above will work here. Spells crit much less often than abilities that use weapons because they don't gain bonus accuracy from weapons you are holding, and they don't gain the benefit of weapon abilities that grant accuracy. This means points in Perception help with spells hitting their targets, but rarely doing crit damage. The best ways to increase your crit chance are by taking passives that affect spells as well, like Uncanny Luck or Dirty Fighting, and by also using abilities that buff crit chance, not just crit chance with weapons. Merciless Gaze and Disciplined Strikes both come to mind. Weapons play little to no impact in spellcasting, and the passive abilities related to them do not affect spells. Two-weapon style does not reduce recovery time with spells, one-handed style does not increase the likelihood of a crit with spells, and two-handed style doesn't increase your spell damage. However, shields will penalize your accuracy, which will affect your spells. Action speed not only reduces cast time, but also reduces recovery time and is extremely helpful to wizards. Look for equipment that increases action speed, and when multiclassing, look for abilities that do as well, like the Monk's Swift Strikes or the Barbarian's Frenzy. Also remember that Dexterity has the same effect, so look for inspirations that increase your Dexterity to further speed up casting. Lastly, be sure to check the spells of grimoires that you find because they might have exactly the ones you need. Study the wiki to see what they give, that way you can plan your build out in advance and not waste ability points on spells you know you can get from using a grimoire. Stay tuned for more Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire class guides as we cover all 11 classes as well as character creation. What did you think of the guide? Was it helpful? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.